So we follow more or less the same, or exactly the same kind of schedule as in previous meetings. I will give a discourse for maybe 45 minutes or something, and then maybe short break, and then we'll have a meditation period together, and then a question and answers session. Yeah. So this week has been a special week for me. This last 4 or 5 days leading up to the 16th. It's been the annual they call Ngan at Wat Bapong at Ajahn Chah's monastery in Ubon, and especially powerful for me these days, living alone, to be joining a sangha of some 900 monks and novices for a few days, and maybe about almost 10,000 lay people, most of them camped out under the trees. And for some of you may have been to this monastery. It's in Ubon, another few hundred kilometers to the northeast of here. But the first thing that hits you when you arrive at the monastery during one of these periods is it's not a very peaceful kind of scene at all, because people from all over the country come and establish what they call dana salas, where basically they just come and cook day and night for anybody who's hungry. And Torsi school has a tent there, and people, there's I don't know how many, 30, 40, 50 tents, and people just cooking around the clock, and anybody can go and have something to eat for free. So it's quite a scene, and a lot of village people go there, and they don't even go into the main part of the monastery. They're going to have something to eat and leave. And some people, usually the Westerners, you get a little bit kind of, this isn't right. But everybody seems to have a great time. Nobody minds. And this year has been a new development. People just arriving with pickup trucks full of food and fruit and everything, and just opening up the back and standing, and anybody who wants anything, they just give it away till it's all gone, and then sort of go off and park their car and go in for the evening chanting. So, and you see these people just giving away food and fruit to people who, as they say, are probably just there for that purpose. It's really quite a wonderful scene in its way. But then you go past that whole kind of area, which is not much different from what you find in a shopping mall probably, and then you're in the main part of the monastery, and as they say, there's just thousands of people sitting, chanting and meditating under the trees around the main hall. And this period is the annual get-together for the reason that our teacher Ajahn Chah died on the 16th of January 1992 and was cremated in 1993. After Ajahn Chah's cremation, I'd been working very hard for a long time, and so I left the monastery and decided to walk along the railway line from Ubon to Bangkok. And everywhere I go, I meet these people, and they say, "Oh, you're Ajahn Chah. Where do you come from?" Ajahn Chah's monastery. And I say, "Oh, Ajahn Chah, he's great. He's fantastic. He's so accurate." What do you mean accurate? because he died on the 16th, and was cremated on the 16th. So everybody bought the 1/6 lottery ticket. And of course it came up. So all the people who sell these underground lottery tickets in Ubon all had to run away because they couldn't pay out all the people who'd won. So that did more for Ajahn Chah's reputation in the countryside than probably any of his Dhamma talks. He is in many ways very unusual teacher. I think in one very obvious way is that his monastery and the monasteries of his disciples continue to grow and thrive many years after his death. Now, if you go to monasteries associated with most of the other great teachers of forest tradition, you'll find that within a very few years, the monasteries tend to kind of wither, and there's hardly anybody living in them. And I think one of the reasons why that is so is that those monasteries were run on a kind of almost a benevolent dictatorship model, in which everything revolved around the charismatic teacher. And so once the teacher's not around anymore, nobody wants to live there. And so what's unusual about Ajahn Chah is that he obviously gave a great deal of thought to creating a community and an institution which would outlive him. And one of the very simple means he did to ensure this would happen is he gave a deal of importance and emphasis to meetings and to practicing together and to doing things together as a group, which is quite unusual in the forest tradition, in which is this idea that group meditations are just for beginners, and if you want to really meditate, you need to be off by yourself and away from all kinds of distractions, and that includes other people. Now, what happens when you run monasteries on that model, as becomes increasingly obvious, is people tend to be very self-concerned after a while. My meditation, and I like to meditate like this, I don't like to meditate like that, and become rather rigid in their style of meditation. And there is little sense of real community and brotherhood in the monasteries. It's just everyone putting forth effort in their meditation, and they're more like satellites revolving around the teacher. So having plenty of meetings, morning and evening meetings together, was a very important means by which a sense of community was created. Now, there are many practices which we took on at Wat Pah Pong, which tend to increase that sense of connection between monks. And one of those are all the duties that the junior novices and monks perform for seniors. Now, in many monasteries, you would do these duties just for the ajahn or for the abbot. So if you're a monk in a forest monastery, most places, one of the ways that you find to have some close personal contact with the teacher is to offer him a massage in the evening. So you go round to the Ajahns kuti, 9, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and there's maybe a dozen monks, and so you're sort of like 2 or 3 on one arm and 2 or 3 on the other arm, and he says you have like 3 or 4 monks a limb, and you all sort of push and prod, and it, you know, it's supposed to be a kind of massage, but it's just a way that you can be very close to your teacher, and he often says things to you that probably wouldn't be said in a more formal kind of situation. But that's about it, really. Bathing the Ajahn is another one, where he sits on a stool and you sort of tip water on him and sort of lather up his body, which again you can get like 6, 7, 8 monks doing that all at the same time. So it can look a bit bizarre if you're not used to it, but it's actually more fun doing it than having it done to you, because I've been in a position of being the recipient of this kind of attention, and yes, you sort of grin and bear it. But Ajahn Chah instituted this system by which a lot of these acts of service would be performed for junior monks, for any monk who was more than 5 years in the monkhood. And there'd be a constant rotation. So as a young monk, rather than just hanging out with your friends and having a group of people all on the same level of seniority with you, then you would have periods of looking after that senior monk for a couple of weeks, and then this senior monk for a couple of weeks. And so you start to develop all these kinds of relationships up and down the hierarchy. And this was, I think, a very good means of creating a sense of warmth and connection. Sort of things that you would do are carrying the monk's bowl on arms round to the village, receive it at the edge of the village, and carry it back again, wash it for him, wash his robes for him, sweep around his kuti for him, all these kinds of things. So also very good for us as Western monks, having to wash people's feet when they come back from alms round and so on. And obviously quite humbling, and very good for weaning oneself away from this obsession with me and my meditation, which can often be quite a big obstacle. Another point about Ajahn Chah was that he was in no way interested in having people who are utterly devoted to him around him all the time. In fact, if he saw anyone was showing signs of excessive devotion, he'd send them the other side of the country to one of his branch monasteries, and usually without any prior notice. This was one thing, you just never knew where you stood with him, and you didn't have any kinds of rights or expectations. In July, the 3 months annual rainy season retreat begins, and most monasteries want to have a quorum of 5 monks in their monastery, because then at the end of the retreat, you are qualified to receive a katina. And a katina ceremony is essentially the offering of cloth for the monks to make new robes, but it's also the annual merit-making ceremony, and at the time when very poor monasteries in the countryside will receive some financial donations which go towards building and so on. So everyone wants to have 5 monks. So the abbots of all the monasteries will converge on Wat Pah Pong like 2 or 3 days before the retreat. I've only got 4 monks I need. Well, give me a monk. Please, will you give me a monk? So if you were if you were there and you wanted to spend the rains retreat with your teacher, you just keep as far away as you can from the central area where all these hungry abbots are looking for recruits. So I had a close friend of mine who is an Australian monk, and he went back to visit his family. And while he was away for a number of months, he fell in love with this woman and decided to get married, and she gave him a return ticket from Sydney. So he arrived like 2 days before the rains retreat with a tray of offerings to ask for forgiveness and to tell Ajahn Chah that he wanted to leave the monkhood and get married. And there was all these abbots looking for new recruits there, and so Ajahn Chah just saw him out the corner of his eye and said, "Oh, you're back. Go off with so-and-so for the rains retreat." And so he just couldn't manage to get out the his confession and his decision to leave the robes. So he just went off on a 3-month retreat instead. And by the end of it, he changed his mind. And actually, this story has I don't know whether it's a happy ending or an unhappy ending, but he ended up disrobing anyway about a year later. But so the point was, you never had any sense of kind of stability or certainty, or even the expectation of being able to live close to your teacher. And as a young monk, I was very diligent in learning Thai because I wanted to have a chance to be his attendant and to be closer to him. And after about a year, I had this opportunity to go with him to another monastery as one of his group of attendants. And it was a wonderful time for me. And the abbot of the monastery in which he was visiting was the most uncharismatic monk in the whole Wat Pah Pong Empire. He's a miserable old man. And he was he was notorious. He wasn't famous. He was notorious in the Wat Pah Pong Empire because, as far as I knew, no monk had ever been able to live with him for more than 6 months without running away. Less than that. So I was attending Ajahn Chah, looking after him from first thing in the morning to late at night, and really, really happy. And then one morning I see him putting on his robe, and he's about to get into a car. And I realize he's going back to Wat Pah Pong, and I'm not ready to go. So I'm very embarrassed, and I say, Luang Por, I'm sorry, can I have like 3 minutes? I need to get my things. And he said, no, it's all right, you're not going. You stay here and be the abbot's attendant. Yes. So I had quite a change to deal with. And in those days, one of the big jobs in the morning, he said these big spittoons like this. And Ajahn Chah chewed betel nut, so sort of betel nut juice. And then in the night he'd use it to urinate. And then have all this, so have urine and betel nut juice and all this kind of stuff. It's full up in the morning. And you'd actually compete to be the one who cleaned it using. And great honor. And take the spittoon away. And so Ajahn Chah left, and then I had to do the same thing for this abbot. And, like rationally, it's just exactly the same fluids in this big spittoon, but it was just a completely different thing altogether. But then I realized, well, yeah, this is exactly what Ajahn Chah was teaching me, of course. And so I, made a real effort to see if I could get the record to be the monk who could live with this monk for the longest without running away. And eventually I did it. I got the record. But I used to walk all the way to Wat Pah Pong, a couple of times a month, and to visit Ajahn Chah, so that was just enough to keep me going. he is, for me, at least, the exemplar of what we call in Theravada Buddhism the Kalyana Mitta, or the good friend. And this is the model of the teacher. The Buddha himself said that he's famously, I'm only the one who points the way. So the ideal, the model is of the Buddha as being one who discovered the truth and then revealed it. And so one is following the Buddha's example and instructions in practicing the Dhamma. But one isn't saved through faith in the Buddha. Where one is saved, one wants to use that word, it's through practicing the teaching. And so the teacher is not a guru, but he's someone who fills you with confidence that this can be done, and one who has the experience and to be able to advise you on the path. And it is that contact with someone who has followed the path to its completion is incredibly powerful. I myself, I think, I don't know whether it's some kind of genetic kind of defect, but I'm someone never ever afraid of anybody. As a teenager, I left home when I was young, traveled around the world, had lots of adventures, and sometimes in some very hairy kinds of situations, particularly in countries like Afghanistan and northern Pakistan and places like that. But I never really experienced any fear, and I realized that it's not any kind of spiritual accomplishment, but a sort of a failure of imagination, really. And anyway, I was fortunate enough to meet a number of teachers in India when I was living there, some of whom were very inspiring in their way. But I was always a little bit kind of cynical and skeptical about sort of guru devotion. When I first arrived in India, I was like 17 years old and ended up in this ashram outside Bombay. And I remember going in for the morning chanting period, and the morning chanting was really, really great. I mean, it had this harmonium, and it's really, really nice. But then the first thing I remember was chanting was like praise to the Guru's sandals. And it was a whole hymn about the spiritual powers embedded in the Guru's sandals. And it just seemed so, the Guru was hard enough, but his sandals, it was even worse. I mean, it's not quite so weird as you'd think. I don't know if any have any experience with this tradition, but it's the idea, similar to the idea of that we make use of in foot massage, that all the nerves and everything end up in the feet. So there's all this sort of energy coming out of the feet. So it's the energy of a very pure person. It goes into his sandals. So his sandals become power objects. But anyway, I wasn't very kind of impressed with all this kind of thing. And so when I arrived in Wat Pah Pong, I was really completely unexpected. I just didn't realize, didn't expect in any way the impact of meeting Ajahn Chah. And I realized I was afraid of him. And it's just so weird, someone who's lived in a monastery for 40 or 50 years and hasn't even killed a single mosquito or an ant, I just feel really, really afraid of him in a way. There's just this idea of just this incredibly powerful natural phenomenon, just like you'd see say a whirlwind, or you see a tsunami, or you see some kind of incredibly powerful natural force, and just a sense of awe, fear. So that would be one part of it. And the other part of it was this sort of sense of love and devotion that he could bring up in his students and disciples. And this is the first quality that the Buddha referred to as being intrinsic to or characteristic of the Kalyana Mitta, or the good friend. Is someone who arouses affection, is someone that you want to be with, you want to be around. And Ajahn Chah would sit in the evenings and talk and answer questions, and 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, nobody's moving, nobody wants to get up, nobody wants to go away, And usually it's the job of the attendant to have to tell people to go back to their kutis or go away. And so the attendant monk used to be very unpopular. And Ajahn Chah, even when he had malaria, or even when he was so ill he could hardly sit up, he'd still would never refuse to speak with people. And there's this kind of magnetic, charismatic quality that he had. And secondly is the characteristic of the good friend is someone who inspires respect for their integrity. Again, I think I've spoken before about one of the aspects of Theravada Buddhism that I particularly appreciated, and that is that the discipline which the monks take upon themselves is one which has no exceptions, and a monk of some 30 years, 40 years, 50 years standing, and one who has generally agreed to be a fully enlightened being still keeps all the same rules as a monk who has only been in the monastery for a week or 2 weeks. And this is very inspiring. It fills one with respect for the monk himself, but for the training as well. And Ajahn Chah would be walking meditation all the time when he was free, until he was ill and couldn't walk very much anymore. Another good example of this is a monk who recently passed away here in Bakchong, who I used to go and visit regularly. And he was 93, 94 years old, and whenever he was free from any other duties, he'd be walking up and down in meditation. And when he couldn't walk by himself, he had like a monk holding him on either side, so he could keep on doing his walking meditation. Even though, again, you would understand that he was fully enlightened, so it wasn't like he was training and everything, but it's out of respect for that practice. So Ajahn Chah was someone who he felt this kind of respect for his life and the way that he'd conducted himself throughout his monastic career. Someone who never took advantage of his power or his authority or his charisma for any purposes of self-aggrandizement. Once when he was famous occasion when he was invited on a number of occasions to take his daily meal in the palace, and he would always go with his bowl, whereas obviously the monks who go and eat in the palace, they eat at a table with all these different dishes in a very kind of refined kind of way, and he would take his bowl into the palace, insist on eating out of his bowl just the same way that he did in the forest. And there's an occasion where he met this very senior monk, and the monk saw him holding his bowl, carrying his bowl into the palace, and the monk said, Aren't you embarrassed in front? Won't you be embarrassed in front of the king, eating out of your bowl like that? And so Ajahn Chah replied to him, he says, won't you be embarrassed in front of the Buddha eating out of a plate? So this is one of the stories that we always tell in Wat Pah Pong. And he received this honor, the Jiao Kun-ship, which was very unusual for forest monks in those days, and people made a lot of fuss about it. And he was asked whether he felt affected by it in any way and in being honored in this way. And he said it's just like the bridge over the Moon River. He said it's not the Moon River in the song, the river in Ubon. This is it's not that when the water level rises, the bridge rises, or the water level falls, the bridge falls. The bridge is the bridge, just the same way it always has been. And that's how he considered himself. So he inspired also emulation. This is the third of these qualities of the good friend, or the Kalyanamitta. Inspires affection, inspires respect, inspires emulation. And he was very clear the fact that he started off just in the same way as everyone else. And sometimes you read the biographies or hagiographies of great monks, and it's like they were completely pure and wonderful from when they were born. And you just feel no kind of, well, it's wonderful, but, it's just, this person's on a completely different planet to me. Whereas Ajahn Chah was always very honest about his failings and his difficulties as a young monk. And in the mid-60s, he was interviewed by one of his students who'd been a scholar monk before going into the forest. And a little biography was produced. And it's not a very satisfactory biography in many ways. It misses a lot of things out. But there's one kind of standout or kind of quite amazing passage in which he talks in quite forthright and surprising detail about his battles with lust as a young monk. And for a monk of his seniority and his fame to allow a book to be printed recounting his difficulties overcoming sexual desire was quite revolutionary for 40 years ago, even today. I mean, it would be. And when the monk was writing this up, he wanted to censor this passage. And Ajahn Chah said, I'll only allow you to print this biography if you print that passage. Because he wanted young monks who were struggling with these things to know that their teacher had been through exactly the same difficulties that they were going through. So this kind of honesty and willingness to be frank about his own difficulties as a young monk was something which again gave his disciples a lot of inspiration to practice and to follow in his footsteps. So that's the third of these qualities. And the fourth one is patience. And so teachers need to be very patient with their students. And he, as I said, would spend hours every day talking with people and instructing people. And many monks start off teaching young monks, and then they get fed up after a while because it doesn't seem to get very far, or not as far as they expect. And Sometimes it can be more interesting to teach lay people who are kind of new and fresh. And if you teach monks, they've heard all your stories, they know, 100 times before, and it's the people you live with, every day in, day out. It's a lot more difficult. And many monks sort of tire of it after a while. But he never did. And he was enthusiastic and as giving and in his 70s as he was in his 30s and 40s. And the patience, he had to show with many of his disciples was quite incredible. And he made a great point of in his training methods of creating conditions where people had to be patient. So many things were made, purposely and unnecessarily difficult. Not out of sort of sadism, but just to force you to be patient, because it's one part of spiritual life that's very hard to develop yourself. I mean, if you start becoming interested in Buddhism or to practice, maybe you can get around to a daily meditation, but to take on a program of frustrating yourself and making things more difficult than they might be otherwise, I don't think many people would be interested in that. But in the long run, really see the value of it. I mean, we eat one meal a day, and go on alms round in the morning, like 5:30. It can be an hour and a half walk, and often the road can have a lot of gravel and be quite painful on your feet, and it can be hot in the summer. And if you've got a bowl full, usually this is quite a small bowl. There are 9 sizes of bowls. There's small, middle small, and big small. Small, middle, big middle, little big, middle big, and big big. So this is kind of big small bowl. And but in those days we used to have much bigger bowls, big iron bowls. This is stainless steel. It's a lot easier to look after. But bowls and upkeep of bowls is a big thing in those days, because the bowls get rusty, and then when the bowls get rusty, then you have to go off into the forest and collect firewood, and then you have to refire the bowl. So it's a really big thing, time consuming. But a big iron bowl full to the top with sticky rice, it's quite a few kilos to walk 4 or 5 kilometers when you haven't eaten for 24 hours, and you have to wear 2 layers of robes, so it's very hot as well. And then you get back, and you've been up since 2:30 in the morning, or just before 3 o'clock for the morning meeting. And you've walked all this way, and you're tired and you're hungry, and then you have to wait for another hour before you can have anything to eat, and you're to sit there and supposed to meditate. Nobody really wants to meditate at that time, so you really have to go against the grain a little bit. And then the food would be distributed. And when I was first to Wapapong, then the food comes in this really big big pots. And then all the monks have to get up and distribute the food. So you get up and you just put your bowl there, and you don't have any say at all about what goes in the bowl. And the monks just come along and just slop all this stuff in, and it's all this horrible kind of you don't even want to know what's in the curry sometimes. And you get back in your bowl, and maybe there's something sweet which is completely submerged under this sort of oily curry mixture, and you've got chili sauce on your bananas, and everything's all mixed up together. but you're still, you're up for it. You're hungry. You haven't eaten for 24 hours. And so Ajahn Chah would be at the head of the dining hall, and we're sitting in this long row, so he can see everybody, and you're aware that he can see you. And you're sitting there, and he has to say a few words to the lay people who are sitting outside who you can't see. And then he'll, and that means it's time to give the blessing. And that means within a few minutes you're going to start to eat. So your ears, you're just waiting for the blessing to end. This and often, quite often, he could see everyone's really, come on, and then he finishes talking, and then everybody goes, and then he starts to talk again, and it's deliberate, but you can't say anything because it's just part of it. So a lot of the things that you put up with as a monk, you put up with because you have this confidence that he's doing it for your own good. It's not just for his enjoyment. Now, if you're in a monastery where monks lack that kind of confidence in the teacher, a lot of these kind of methods just go horribly wrong, and people end up leaving because that sort of confidence in the integrity and the compassion of the teacher is central to this. So Ajahn Chah could be very fierce, but he could also be incredibly kind and warm. And it was just you never had this fixed idea of who he was as a person in the way that you do with most people that you live with, because he could just change so rapidly and be completely different people in completely different times and places, and just switch just like this. And so another one of these qualities he had was in communication. And you could be sitting under his kuti night, and he's got like some soldiers over here, some army people, and some villagers, some people from Bangkok, some visiting monks, and all these different, quite discrete groups with different values and different interests. And he'd be sitting there, and he'd start talking to these soldiers, and talking to in a way that you could really see that they could relate to the kind of language he was using, similes he was using. And then he talked to village people, and immediately he sort of tuned in to where they were, worries about their rice crop or their children or the drug problem in the local village or something. And then he's talking with some Bangkok people about their business, and just this completely effortless, seamless movement from talking with one group of people to another group of people, and the whole body language, the vocabulary, the tone of voice was changing, and yet you didn't feel that he was sort of playing a part. It was just this natural kind of flow of being totally attuned to who he was talking to, and whoever he was talking to was the most important person at that time. And unfortunately you do find monks and people who tend to give more time and attention to wealthy people than to the village people. But this was never the case with Ajahn Chah, and everyone was equally important to him. And he had this wonderful ability to explain Dhamma in very simple, down-to-earth terms. I think sometimes there is a bit of a fetish about simplicity in Dhamma presentation. There's, I think, a very good quotation from Einstein. Is that make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. So sometimes Dhamma can be explained too simply, just from the point of view of fear of sounding difficult. But because he had grasped the the essence of the teachings. He was able to apply it in a very natural and convincing way. So often the things that he would use to explain Dhamma would be the things that were around him. There's this sort of use a bottle of water, or a tissue, or a clock, or a spittoon, or a carpet, or just anything and everything around him could be employed to explain the Dhamma. And so this was another reason why Dhamma practice began to seem something really practical, something that you could do, and not so intimidating and so way above your head. And he was always. I remember once I was sitting there, and he was answering questions in this very kind of cryptic and terse kind of way. And one American monk who was sitting with me, he said, "Luang Por, that was really Zen." And he and he said, "No, it wasn't. It was just me. It's just the way I talk." And so you sort of project all these things onto him. But sometimes it was deceptively simple. There was some missionary came to debate some points of Dhamma with him, and he said, "Oh, in Buddhism you teach about not self." So he had his questions written down on a piece of paper. So who knows not self? Okay, it's the idea being that if there's a knower of not self, then that knower must be self. So Ajahn Jayasaro just immediately says, well, who knows the knower of not self? Just very simply pointing out this kind of infinite regress of the fact that you can posit a knowing of not self. It doesn't follow from that there is therefore a self. Just as this with the first cause, this is this infinite regress. Well, if there's a first cause, what's the cause of the first cause? Why shouldn't there be? Or if you say there is a self, then who knows the self? So you say, well, if there's anatta or not self, then who knows anatta? Well, Ajahn Jayasaro said, well, then who knows atta? Who knows self? So there would be things that afterwards you just kind of unravel and pick apart. You say, well, that sounded like really simple, but when you think about it, it's really quite profound. So he had this ability to explain things very, very simply. One thing I didn't realize when I was first there was that really he was speaking Thai as a second language. His first language was Lao. And so some of his phrases were quite unique. They're not things that you would find in a Thai dictionary. And he'd be translating them from Lao in his mind. And one of them that I particularly liked was this phrase that everything is, he said, "Ben Kong Man Yu Yang Nan," which is a translation of the Lao, "Ben Kong Man Yu Yang San," which means it's, I don't know how you can say it in English. It means, it's just that way. It's just that way because of all the causes and conditions that have led to it being like that. So, if let's say, you have a cup of coffee, which consists of water and coffee and milk and maybe sugar, and then you taste it, and you say, well, why does it taste that way? Well, it tastes that way because it's got precisely that amount of water, that kind of coffee, that amount of milk, that amount of sugar. And given exactly those quantities of coffee, water, milk, and sugar, then you have that taste. That taste is the inevitable result of that particular combination of those particular things. And so but that's a recognition. is not the end of the story. It's not just recognizing the way things are and then being at peace with it. Because the next step is, well, do you want to do something about it? Could you do something about it? How could you do something about it? So in the case of coffee, there's a possibility of making it sweeter. You could add some more sugar, perhaps, if you had sugar. Or you could add more water, or you could add more coffee. Some things you can add, some things you can take away, you can dilute, you can strengthen. There are certain possibilities that become apparent when you're aware of the causes and conditions that have led up to this particular phenomena. And so he would be teaching this, but not in a philosophical way, but in a very direct way and using very simple words. And his vocabulary is not extensive. You don't have to study Thai language very long before you can read his teachings or listen to them. But many of the things that he said were things you'd heard 100 times before, but he said them and it wasn't quite the same because of that power he had, that sense that he gave you that he was talking from his own experience rather than from memory. And I think in teaching, this is something that we easily forget, that often the main thing that we're teaching is who we are, or how we live our lives, or what we're doing, and sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on the content and the words that we use, rather than the relationship within which those words appear. So if you have a poor relationship with very little trust, very little affection and love and kindness, then even very wise words can just die away and not have any effect on the listener. Whereas when the work's been done on the relationship, then those words can really have a very powerful, long-lasting effect. I'm reminded of studies they've done on various kinds of psychotherapy, which technique is the best technique, and in the end, the studies I've seen tend to summarize that it's not so much the technique, it's the relationship between the therapist and the therapy, which is the main cause of change, if any is indeed apparent. So he was able to create that kind of relationship in which the words that he used were very powerful. I was talking to a friend of mine who's visiting from England recently, who was at Wat Pah Pong some years before me. And he said, the thing is that people don't realize, listening to these talks, reading the books, is that most of Ajahn Chah's talks were really boring. And it's true. I mean, he talked for hours and hours and hours, and a lot of it wasn't that memorable. It was more just to make you have to sit there basically and put up with it until you're just willing to die and just. This posture, this papier posture, is not a very comfortable posture, and it's absolutely compulsory in forest monasteries, to when you listen to Dhamma, to sit like this. So that was kind of an added difficulty for many of us. But in the end, with these sort of privations and difficulties and so on, it's all within the context of you want to be there, you've chosen to be there, and you feel incredibly fortunate to be there. And so it wasn't something that really, at least with me, caused me a lot of suffering. I just thought I was so lucky, as a young man, to stumble upon this and to have this kind of training. So I've been going through the characteristics of the Kalyana Mitra, or the good friend. I think I've been through 6 of them. One is that he inspires love, affection, devotion, inspires respect, inspires emulation. He's very patient. He's someone who is a great communicator, someone who is able to explain difficult and profound topics in an idiom which is clear, straightforward, easy to understand. And the last of these qualities is that the good teacher, never leads you on a wrong path. And so the good teacher, I say, never wants to create a cult, never supports that kind of devotion to him as a person. He's not someone who uses his power over other people for any unwholesome ends, doesn't manipulate people, makes every kind of sacrifice, just as to compare it to a doctor who wants the patient to get well. He doesn't want to be that person's doctor forever. He wants the person to be liberated from the doctor, meaning be healthy. And I think, again, with Ajahn Chah, it was very much the case. So he, when in 1982, he was already rather ill. He had diabetes and many other problems, and he spent a rains retreat in this mountain monastery about 100 kilometers away from Wat Bapong. And I was staying at Wat Nanachat at that retreat, and the whole community from Wat Nanachat went up to visit him and pay respects to him. And we sat in his kuti, which was some 50 meters or so behind the main hall. And at the end of the discourse he gave, we were walking over to the main hall, and I was walking along beside him. And due to he had a walking stick, but he's still not very, very stable, and the rocks and things were not very easy to walk upon. And he put his hand out and grabbed my arm, and so walked the rest of the way with him holding my arm. And I thought, this is the happiest I've ever been in my whole life. I would never have thought, when I left home and sort of searching for adventure, that I would find a sort of fulfillment in this. If I could spend the rest of my life with just sort of him holding on my arm and me leading him about, I'd be happy. And then that period when I was first here in Thailand, in northeast Thailand, we were expecting a communist invasion, and there were always these kind of pamphlets being distributed about the coming invasion, and so it was on everybody's mind. And I had all these dreams, and it was the best dreams I've had in my life. And it was the communists invaded, and there were tanks at the front of the monastery, and Ajahn Chah and I got out the back, and it was just me and him. We had to get to Bangkok. And we were hiding in barns, and me sort of going out foraging, and of course he couldn't walk very, he's holding my arm, and so I had a very although I didn't live with him for very long, he affected me incredibly, and so it's always very enjoyable for me to go to this annual ceremony in Wat Bapong. And this last 2 or 3 years, they have on the day, on the 16th in the morning, that day is reaches its climax in the afternoon when they have this long procession of circumambulation around the stupa, which are enshrined his relics. So you have these like 900 monks in this big long line, and then thousands and thousands of lay people all holding. There's that photograph over there. You see that? That's from that in that corner over there. That's from a previous year. And in the morning, before the meal, there's a Dhamma talk. And so there are thousands and thousands of people all sitting out under the trees in the hall, and all these hundreds of monks. And the last couple of years, I've been the monk that's been given the task of giving the Dhamma discourse to the multitudes before the meal. And it's just such a wonderful feeling to sit on the same seat where Ajahn Chah used to sit, and to be speaking in front of all his disciples, both the ordained and the lay groups. And I always trying to say something to see if I can, it's not quite so deliberate as that, but usually manage to bring a few tears to people's eyes on this day, because everyone's kind of a bit emotional anyway. So on what was it, on Thursday or Friday, whenever it was, Friday, I was on the seat and I said, Ajahn Chah has been passed away now 17 years, and in a moment I thought, I bet that's in the lottery tomorrow, 1-7. But then I put that thought to the back of my mind, and I said, and we say like Ajahn Chah's passed away and left us here 17 years ago, but actually, Ajahn Chah's not gone anywhere, and his Dhamma is still here for us the same way as it's always been. But it's all of us who tend to leave Ajahn Chah and turn our back on him and forget him and forget the things that he taught us. And so a few people starting to get a bit teary around this time. So yeah, just to give you an idea of the atmosphere at Wat Pah Pong the other day, where I've been the last few days. Okay, I think I've talked a bit longer than I intended to, and thank you for your patience in listening. And so at the end of the talk, please feel free to get up and stretch your legs for a few minutes, and then we'll have a meditation period afterwards.